lovely to meet you all. Right, so I'm Zehra. I head up Connection Planning at Meta, and I'm here to talk through the importance and the value of uncomfortable conversations. And uncomfortable conversations are hugely important when we talk about diversity, and specifically because we know diversity unlocks discovery. We know that by representing diverse voices, by representing diverse perspectives, it drives growth, it drives discovery, it drives the opportunity to explore endless possibilities. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. We know diversity is the right thing to do, but we also know it makes business sense. So we see this in research. Representative ads drive greater levels of effectiveness. We see a 44% increase in stock share, we see 69% higher performance, and we see 83% increase in brand preference when it comes to driving greater levels of representation. The latest research from Kantar and Unstereotype Alliance, which looked at over 3,500 studies, multiple countries, multiple categories, proved once again that what they call progressive advertising, which is more representative advertising, drives greater levels of distinction and purchase intent. So we know representative ads work, but how do we get to that? How do we get to the most valuable representative communications? Our starting point is obviously get the right people in the room. You know, always represent diverse voices and diverse perspectives in the room. I often say ideas don't go wrong at the start, they go wrong at the end. Get the right people in the room. But that alone isn't enough. We need to be able to create the conditions for these audiences to challenge bias, to call things out. And this is what we mean by the importance of uncomfortable conversations. And the reality is if you aren't facing some level of discomfort when it comes to DEI, you're probably not learning enough. And I think the quote that just brings this to life so well is by Adam Grant. I'm just going to read it out and just look back. The highest compliment from someone who disagrees with you is not you were right, it's you made me think differently. And that's what's hugely important, and that's what uncomfortable conversation allows you to do. And it's particularly important given this space is full of bias. And so it's incredibly important to mitigate against this bias. And research within bias shows three key things that I think are really important to call out. The first is presuming objectivity produces worse results. So the more likely you are to think you're fair and square, the more likely you are to produce worse results when it comes to any form of testing, when it comes to bias, which I think is really fascinating. It's ironic because you almost have to assume that you might get it wrong in order to not get it wrong. So you're really mitigating and being very considered about putting things in place. The second point is, you know, although we're constantly trying to scrape bias out of our brain, it will naturally always reset to what's dominant in culture. And thirdly, when we're most stressed, we're most likely to be on autopilot, we're most likely to look for navigation tools to get through, and that relies on a lot of stereotypes. So hugely important to mitigate against this, and this is where uncomfortable truths are so important. So for the remainder of this time, I'm going to talk through 4 uncomfortable truths as starting points that I'd love us to explore and get together and get behind as an industry. So the first uncomfortable truth is based on representation. So I'm going to stand here. So the latest research from Kantar, which looked at 50 of the largest media spending brands on 30-second ads, showed 92% of brands showed people of colour. 43% of brands had at least one occurrence of a senior citizen in their ads, and 94% of brands showed women in a primary role. So that seems, you know, pretty okay. The reality is, although we saw 92% of brands showed people of colour, only 15% were culturally represented by more than their skin colour. Although 43% of brands had at least one occurrence of a senior citizen, hardly any showed them in characters of power. And although 94% of brands showed women in a primary role, majority of these instances were stereotypical roles. So I think the uncomfortable conversation we have to have here when we look at this data is, are we perpetuating a stereotype? Are we making things worse? Are we doing enough? And the reality is, the Unstereotype Alliance data shows that since March 2020, ads have been less likely to show women in speaking roles, less likely to show women working, and more likely to cast women in traditional gender roles. So I think this is a really important, uncomfortable conversation that we need to lean into when it comes to representation in comms. And so in terms of mitigating bias, in terms of challenging and making improvements within this space, it's always important to ask ourselves 3 key questions. Of course, am I represented in your advertising? Is my audience represented in your advertising? But beyond that, really importantly, do you share my values? Am I being seen authentically as I am? And finally, am I represented in your decision making? Is there a voice representing this audience to mitigate against some of these stereotypes? So that's the first bias. Are we doing better than we think we are? The power of mitigating bias within representation. The second uncomfortable truth is around language. So interestingly, the most popular statement a woman who turns 40 gets is, "You don't look like you're in your 40s." So what does that mean? Is that a compliment? Or is it just that we don't know what 40 looks like anymore? And the data shows we don't. When it comes to global web index data, when we're asked, how representative do you feel in the advertising you see? And we're asked, and 40 plus women are asked this question, the percentage of women who feel represented in the ads they see, 3%. Only 3% of 40 plus women in the UK feel represented in the ads they see. So there is so much more that we can do here. And sometimes, when it's incredibly overt, we can call it out, like it was with the government advertising in the start of the pandemic with stay home and very stereotypical roles. But actually, and that was called, thankfully, but actually, I think, when we look at bias in language, when we look at the bias that's in our everyday language, in our everyday products, in our everyday beauty products, in our everyday shelves, language like anti-aging, repelling against age, I think it's really important to start having these conversations around the use of language against this hugely important audience. And the things we can do here to mitigate against this bias, so Textio is a great tool that literally scrapes the data and really understands the different gender bias in this particular instance that might be at play. The third bias I'd like to explore is bias in targeting. So I think it's really important that we're aware of the bias that comes through in language when it comes through in segmentation. And we see it even in the way in which we buy audiences, some of the stereotypical language that's used. This is just an example from the autos category. And we had a segmentation provided to us, but we also compared that against just using the algorithm to go broad. Just go broad, don't have that segmentation, and how does it fare within the autos category? And what was really interesting is, and I'll read it at the back, is broad audiences doubled the number of women exposed to the campaign. We saw 25% increase in test drives, which we know is hugely critical when it comes to autos, and the broad audience reached 1.6 million more users. So really important just to be mindful and mitigate against bias within segmentation, and to allow when you're using Meta and when you're using our platforms, allow the audience to go broad. And finally, the final bias that I think is really interesting and important to recognise is cultural bias. So right now, we are experiencing the third biggest moment in the UK. It's the equivalent of 30 days of Christmas, 4 million audience, 200 million pounds space, 2 billion observing it across the world, and that's Ramadan. And many of you might think of that as a month to do with refraining from food and drink, which it absolutely is. But if we were to push and challenge stereotypes within this month, and we look at some of our user data, we can actually see that this month is the kindest month on Meta. when we look at CrowdTangle data that looks at the most engaged terms on our platform, and we look at the most engaged terms when it comes to kindness, we see a peak on the first day of Ramadan and on the last day, which is Eid. So again, a really interesting context for positive communication, for purposeful messaging, for opportunities to donate. People want to be more charitable. So again, really understanding this audience like no other allows you to tap into contextually relevant opportunities and ultimately drive growth. So, in summary, I can see the ticker furiously ticking away. In summary, 4 key areas to really minimize bias. The first, minimize bias in representation. The second, minimize bias in language. Minimize bias in targeting, and minimize our cultural bias. And at the heart of that, at the heart of minimizing bias, is around creating the conditions to have uncomfortable conversations that allow us to call this bias out. That's me. Thank you very much.